Okay, good morning, everyone. It is just now 10:30, and we are live on YouTube, and we are live on Zoom, and we've got a number of people who have connected already. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started, at least. Okay, good morning, everyone. It is just now 10:30, and we are live on YouTube. All right, we had a little technical moment, but we're back. All right, so it is my great pleasure on behalf of Alianza Americas to welcome two amazing panelists that we have here with us today, Laura Carlsen and Rick Jones. And this webinar is going to focus on the topic of demonstrations and popular discontent in Latin America. My name is Amy Shannon. I am Senior Advisor here at Alianza Americas. I'm going to moderate this conversation this morning. We are co-sponsoring this event with the Latin American Working Group. So we thank very much our partners at Latin American Working Group for joining us in this event, and also our two speakers. We convened this, I think, for reasons that now, even in the intervening 2 weeks, have become more obvious because we've seen so many expressions in recent days of citizens of Latin America expressing emphatically with anger and frustration, and even in some cases, violence, their frustration about the economic and social and political order in their countries. In Chile, we saw this sparked by the rise in subway fares, but of course the issue goes much deeper than that. In Ecuador recently, we have the issue of the gas subsidies that triggered a strong reaction from indigenous communities, a very coordinated response that actually caused the government to flee to Guayaquil and eventually broker a negotiated solution. We have the example in Haiti, where the economic crisis and the assassination of a journalist have recently provoked an outpouring of protest and some repression in that country. We have the ongoing repression of social protest in Honduras that's been going on really since the elections 2 years ago. And now, just this week, we have the case of Bolivia, where President Evo Morales was essentially forced to resign in the midst of violent demonstrations and an intervention of the police and the army, which many are referring to as a coup d'etat. But in any case, it is definitely a very dramatic moment that we are observing here in Bolivia. And I think therefore, and you know, other things are happening in the region that are maybe not so dramatic, but we've seen, for example, in Argentina, the election of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner, kind of a rejection of the previous more neoliberal approach. We have the first woman mayor of Bogota recently elected. And so I think what we're trying to get a better sense of is what's underneath all this popular discontent in the region. What has changed, or is it exactly that nothing has changed? What are the ways in which the democratic systems are responding or failing to respond? And are the political and social systems really able to respond to the needs and demands of the system, of the people, or really are they just channeling the needs of a very small economic and political elite? So we've got these wonderful two speakers here with us today, and we came together with Latin American Working Group to have this conversation, hoping to really get to a much more nuanced understanding of popular discontent in the region and its expressions. So I'd like to introduce you first to Laura Carlsen. She is the director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. Laura holds a BA in Social Thought and Institutions from Stanford, a master's in Latin American Studies also from Stanford. And apparently she went down to Mexico on a Fulbright and never came back. So she has been there for many, many years and is really regarded as a very strong journalist and analyst of the entire Latin American region. So welcome, Laura. You're muted. Hang on. You need to unmute yourself.
Wait, there it goes. Okay, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. We also have Rick Jones. Rick is the Youth and Migration Advisor in Latin America and the Caribbean for Catholic Relief, but he has held many posts in El Salvador over the years and has is really one of our most trusted advisors in the region. He's worked on poverty, gang violence, migration, internal displacement, among other issues. And we often turn to Rick when we want to get a better sense of what's going on and what's behind the headlines. So thank you very much, Rick, for joining us.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here.
Great. So thank you so much. We appreciate your being able to be with us today. We're going to do this as a series of questions. We hope to really spend about an hour on the webinar total. So we'll ask you to limit your interventions to 3 or 4 minutes at a time so that we can continue to ask questions and then also invite our listeners to ask questions. We can be flexible as well. So if you have questions for each other, or if there's something that I'm not asking that you want to make sure we talk about, please feel free to bring it up and to put it on the table. And I would also ask those of you who are listening as attendees to please send your questions either through this chat box or through the Q&A. And we'll be monitoring the questions so that after we've done a few backs and forths amongst us, we will turn to your questions as well. So let's start off with the first intervention. I wanted to ask you both, is this a new expression of discontent or what has changed? What I'd like to just to help ask both of you to just characterize what's happening in Latin America right now and the Caribbean, and how should we understand that? Laura, do you want to start?
Sure, Amy. I think it's hard to generalize, first of all, and I think one of the big lessons that's coming out of this situation, in which it's new in the sense that all of a sudden we have a number of countries that are undergoing different forms of upheavals. And that's what's caught the world's attention. And there is a common line among those that many of them, not all of them, but many of them have to do with accumulated frustration at the neoliberal model, and in particular at inequality. So we've had, our analysts in the region, several in different countries have mentioned that one of the big things that they're seeing is that historically, when you see an uprising, it's not because poverty has become so crushing that people can no longer stand it. There's some examples, but generally speaking, it's more that their horizons, the direction of social mobility has begun to move downward rather than upward. And when they see their horizons being cut off, the chances for their children, there's more of a likelihood to see the kinds of uprisings that we're seeing now. So if we take them really quickly, and take a look at what's happening, we've got Chile, Ecuador, Haiti, and Honduras, where there's essentially mass movements against important aspects of neoliberalism, as well as a strong political component, that is the lack of functioning democracy under their representative systems. Electoral democracy is failing people who have very strong demands. And then we have Bolivia and Argentina, and to a certain degree Peru, where the conflicts that we're seeing have more to do with that electoral sphere, but they're also converging with these grassroots demands that have been unfulfilled. And of course, with foreign intervention in Bolivia as a case that we'll talk about the coup d'etat there at greater length later on.
Thank you, Laura. Rick, how would you characterize what's happening right now?
Thanks. I would add to this context, I think we need to understand that there have been different both economic and political legitimacy triggers to the current uprising and protests and demonstrations. Just historically, in the late 70s, 17 out of 20 countries were military dictatorships. By the year 2000, we had 17, 18 out of 20 elected democracies. And in the last 20 years, and today, over that last 20 years, what started as a great belief in the promise of democracy, today in the region, we have only half of the people living in Latin America believe in democracy. And only a quarter of the people, or 25%, are satisfied with what it's achieved. We continue to be the most unequal region in the world, the most violent region in the world. And I think that's created an incredible level of dissatisfaction. And as Laura pointed out, the neoliberal economic model has not delivered. And so the level of frustration is very high. Now, I think the current of all of the detonators, the political system across the region, the system of political parties has been captured and infiltrated by a new set of political and economic illicit actors, meaning in some places that's organized crime, narco traffickers from Mexico and Central America, and even in South America. And we have a whole set that are corrupting the interest and the actions of political parties in Latin America, who increasingly are acting in favor of the interests of these illicit actors and economic elites, and not in the interests of the general population. And so I
Is it frozen up?
Yeah, I think we froze. We froze on Rick there for a second.
Well, I'll take advantage while he's coming back to add that two other aspects I think are very important about what we're seeing now. One is the high level of youth involvement. And that again has to do with seeing society of concentration of wealth and power and of inequality in which they're feeling excluded and are asking for a place within that. And that's interesting because there's been a long time when there was this assumption that the youth were apathetic or not as involved as we're certainly seeing them here in these recent uprisings. And the other one on the political side of the picture of what's causing it is that young women in particular, feminist organizations, they're generally fed up with the normalization of gender violence. And we're seeing a much higher level of organization of feminists and of women's demands, and of not just specifically women's demands, but a different way of looking at politics that's a characteristic of some of this grassroots organization and the uprising that we're seeing now too.
I was going to go back to Rick because he had reappeared, but apparently he has disappeared again. So I'm going to move on actually specifically then also to the question about Bolivia. Laura, I don't know if you've got any thoughts about, we've got the army and the police in this playing this major role there. What is your perception of what's going on in Bolivia and how we should understand that situation?
Well, Bolivia, Evo Morales just arrived in Mexico, I guess, day before yesterday. And so it's been kind of Bolivia 24/7 around here lately. And I've been looking at it very carefully. I'm totally convinced that there was a coup d'etat in Bolivia and that we have to call it as such. This does not mean that one is 100% in favor of all the policies of Evo Morales over his long tenure in the presidency in Bolivia. But it's very important to understand that no matter what criticisms you have, it's not okay for the armed forces to force a president not only out of office, but out of his country under threat of his life. Taking family members of his cabinet and hostage, burning houses, raiding houses, what we're seeing there is an extremely dangerous situation. Also, we need to look at very carefully at the role that the Organization of American States, and particularly Luis Almagro, has played in this whole thing, because there's a new study out by CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and I was talking to a representative yesterday, and we were looking at that study, and I have myself had done the analysis of their actions and their preliminary report. And the thing is that the OAS never accuses the Morales administration of fraud, or the government, of fraud in this case. They point to a number of irregularities, and it turns out actually that their statistical analysis is wrong, in terms of this being a very weird thing that there was a turnaround, because historically it's always been the case that when those rural votes come in later, they're more heavily in favor, everyone knows this, of the Morales government. And their statistical analysis was not just wrong, but it was done in such a way as to arrive at this alarmist conclusion that basically detonated the violence that we're seeing today. In addition, their hypotheses were wrong, and there's really no indication that there was in fact a fraud. Not the suspension of preliminary results is rather normal. So that can get a little bit technical, but it's very important, because what was created then was, in a tinderbox of a situation, inputs that would just explode that situation, and that's what's happened. And now a person who was like 7th in line for the presidency has declared herself the president, or 5th or something, without any participation of the Congress. Countries don't know whether to recognize it or not. Evo Morales is here talking about going back, but he still fears for his life. And nobody's really seen a way out. And it's been very disappointing to me to see so many progressives defending what's clearly a coup with US government participation. The United States jumped on it immediately, not only to celebrate the fact that the president had been ousted and exiled, but also to recognize this fraudulent, talk about fraudulent, new president. And that's been supported by an ultra-right that's extremely macho, that's fundamentalist, that's violent, that has neo-Nazi elements within it, and that could do tremendous amount of damage to the country and to the continent.
Thanks, Laura. Given that and that's sobering, given that we're still trying to get Rick back on, I actually wanted to pivot a minute and ask you to talk a little bit about Haiti, because as much as Bolivia is now front and center in the news, Haiti is once again, not surprisingly, pretty much lost to the news. But we do know that a combination of economic reasons and violence are really sparking a lot of popular mobilization, and even requests for resignation of the president. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about Haiti, which probably should be in the news, but is not.
It's really important to take it into account, because first of all, we are seeing in Haiti a number of the same kinds of characteristics that we're seeing in these uprisings against neoliberalism, or against different forms, which has to do with the economic model, the poverty, and the ingovernability that has affected that part of the island for so long. The Haitians, when they first flared up in a big way, these demonstrations that have actually been going on for a couple of years now, one of the things that happened, for example, was when the government of Jovenel Moïse, who is accused of corruption, many people are convinced that he just downright stole money that came in from Petrocaribe, the Venezuelan program of subsidies for fuel, and a number of other accusations of corruption. And then when the US government pressured Moïse to agree to sanctions against Haiti, the people were also extremely upset, because it'd been one of their few supporters, the Venezuelan government, over the years, and geopolitically, they had they were really upset to see that kind of closeness to the Venezuelan government, I mean to the United States government. So there's all these factors coming in. They're facing scarcity. As things fall apart, it becomes a downward cycle. And the news is basically ignoring it. Not only the news, but the international community as well. In addition to the demonstrations, there's been violent repression. A friend of mine over at KPFK in Los Angeles has sent a number of delegations down with Danny Glover, with Maxine Waters and others. And it's shocking what they're finding out, and especially in this context of a news blackout on it. There's confusion in the United States, in the Congress, of what to do. Because on the one hand, you don't want to call for US intervention, but there's a strong sense, and what should be done is to call for transparency and an investigation in what the degree of US intervention is now. There have been a number of disturbing incidents in which they have found, there was just one yesterday, I think, in which they have captured arms smugglers coming from the United States, in which they've captured, they have revealed espionage and efforts that support Moise in this context. And so the first thing to do is to find out what the United States government is doing. In general, I think as we look at these problems on a country by country basis, because we can generalize somewhat, but it's really important at this point for us to understand the real specific dynamics of all of them and what the US government is doing in all of them. And we need a lot more information for the analysis, the kind of analysis that we're doing, that many people are doing, that solidarity groups need to do. That is a country by country analysis and just has a lot more information in terms of what the government's doing. That's certainly the case in Haiti.
To that specific point, actually, which I think is very important, is there anything you can say, and maybe it is country by country, or some commonalities that would distinguish the places where people are, where there's like popular unrest in the streets, where these popular manifestations are taking place, and in the countries where they're not?
Yeah, I don't know. That's maybe these listeners have something they want to weigh in on that question, because it's the age-old question, of revolutions and of social protests and of changes in governments. Like what's a trigger? And it's oftentimes, I know here in Mexico, unexpected. We can think, the people are putting up with so much, the quality of life is going down, and then all of a sudden the detonator will be a 2 peso increase in the price of tortillas, or in Ecuador or in Chile, a tiny increase in the cost of public transportation or in the cost of gasoline, and it happens. And it's always, it's not because that issue was the issue, it's always accumulated tensions, but we have very little way of knowing in many ways what's going to be the trigger on those. I think that probably eventually we'll see, it was pretty clear in Argentina what triggered the change in the elections, because Macri and his neoliberal policies absolutely tanked the economy. And they'd seen that too often, and they were going to continue to go down that road, and so there was a change. There's another thing that we have to take into account, though, too, in some of these situations where the uprisings have been of the right, and that is that progressive governments, that our definitions of left and right are not holding, and that progressive governments are taking on many of the kinds of neoliberal policies that the left has traditionally rejected. So in the case of Bolivia, and if Gudinas were here, he would certainly talk about this, in the case of Bolivia, in the case of Ecuador, even before the change of government from Correa to Moreno, we see a real dependence on an extractivist model which clashes with many indigenous beliefs in the relationship of the community to the human community to Mother Earth, and clashes very specifically with the interests of communities over local control, to protect local control of natural resources. So there's some big mistakes being made by governments in thinking that, well, we'll just adopt kind of these neoliberal policies in order to begin to change the economy, and then at some point in the future, we'll become more consistent with our principles. Of course, they don't say it that way, but that's the way many people are seeing it. And it's a common factor in some of the uprisings and the divisions that we're seeing, the polarization that we're seeing in societies.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think two things that you mentioned actually provoked me to think that I've been remiss in mentioning that Eduardo Budinas was unable to join us. Originally planned to be on this webinar today, but given all that's happening in Bolivia, he's kind of been pulled into that conversation in many different ways, and so he was not able to join us today, but he has promised me faithfully that he will do another webinar with us, probably in Spanish, coming up in the coming days. So I hope everybody will be able to come back for that conversation. Eduardo is always a very, very interesting analyst and does exactly the kind of thing that you were just mentioning, Laura, making these connections between the control of natural resources, the extractivist economic model, and the political failures in the region. So I think that will be an interesting conversation, and I'm really glad you brought it to the fore. And I'm also really glad you mentioned that people should ask questions and also offer their own analysis in the Q&A, because I know we have people on the line that are also who are also experts, and we would love to start to hear from you. And I think we are starting to hear from you. And then one piece of very good news is that I believe we have now managed to get Rick back on, at least with a telephone connection. So if you can hear me, Rick, please say hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, this happens. That's why we are flexible humans. All right, so we're glad to have you back, and wondered actually, Rick, if you would like to comment. We've been talking a little bit about Bolivia, and Laura raised some really important points about how we need to kind of unpack these situations country by country. We talked a bit about the case of Haiti, which has kind of dropped off the radar in the news here in the US, but has a lot of important features in terms of the role of the United States government. And in that light, I wondered if you could speak, Rick, about whether or not you're seeing any connections between what's going on in South America and some of what we're seeing in Central America with the discontent, expressions of discontent in Nicaragua, or the sort of ongoing repression of social unrest in Honduras that maintain and against the fraudulent electoral process there. Do you see parallels, differences? How would you characterize those similarities or differences?
Thanks. And sorry again about dropping off. The internet just dropped here. I think in talking about some of the parallels with Central America, especially Nicaragua and Honduras, we're definitely seeing the tendency toward an increasing discourse about the illegitimacy of democracy and democratic governance from ruling elites. And a lot of people, left and right, who are in power, trying to find ways with the mask of legal legitimacy to stay in power indefinitely. Evo Morales in Bolivia had tried to do that in the 2016 referendum, and certainly the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega have created the laws under their own, in their own image, to be able to stay in power indefinitely. So I do think there are parallels in terms of what people are reacting against, in terms of the illegitimacy of these governments who are trying to stay in power. similarly in Honduras, people are reacting against the illegitimacy of electoral fraud that happened 2 years ago in the election, and really the illegitimacy of the coup that happened there in 2009. So I think there are some parallels in terms of the public really just rejection of people trying to stay in power indefinitely. On the other hand, the detonators have been political in Honduras and Bolivia around electoral fraud. In Nicaragua, it's more like Haiti and Chile in terms of the economic and social policies that really just have shown a complete disregard for the impact of those policies on the population. So there are some similarities and differences between what's happening in those countries. I also think the role, and I don't know about this in South America, certainly the role of social media played an important role in mobilizing young people in Nicaragua and mobilizing the opposition. The other thing I would note about that is that the willingness to use violent repression against the population, I think, is increasing across the continent. And I think those are important parallels to pay attention to as the police and the military continue to increase their role, and the governments who are in power are increasingly willingness to repress the population again. And so that's a dangerous recipe for democracy.
Yeah, I want to jump in there because there's a specific question that has to do with this that says, are there significant differences between the elections of 2017 in Honduras and the recent elections in Bolivia? And I've been thinking about that a lot, because clearly as progressives, we can't say it's not okay to oust an elected president here, but when it's popular uprising, it is okay to, we have to define what are the criteria there. And the criteria can't just be ideological. They have to be a consistent defense of democracy and the right of the majority to decide. Here's what happens with Honduras and Bolivia. 2 presidents who changed the constitution or who changed the law in order to go up for re-election, something which is not in itself illegitimate, except for how they did it. I mean, in the one case, Juan Orlando manipulates a court that he stacked, and in the other case, Evo Morales loses the referendum and then goes to the court. So they're both somewhat suspect the way they do it. There's plenty of countries that have unlimited term limits and it's still considered a democracy, but they're both suspect how they did it. Next, you've got those presidents who go into an election and there's accusations of fraud at the election. In the case of Juan Orlando, the fraud was pretty much substantiated. In the case of Evo Morales, there's a lot more doubt about whether there was fraud. Also, in the case of Juan Orlando, he basically lost the popular vote. In the case of Evo Morales, and you have to remember this, we're only talking about whether he won the popular vote by 9% or by 10%. Because of the second round of elections, the way they have it. He clearly has the support of the majority of the population who went to the polls. There's no doubt about that, on any side. So then what happens after this is the point of divergence. Juan Orlando stands up alongside the charge d'affaires, because there's no ambassador, in Honduras, and says, well, they both also, another parallel is supposedly there was a break in the electoral reporting, everyone talks about that. Again, that's explained in the Bolivian case. In the Honduran case, it certainly looked like a factor of the fraud. But so Juan Orlando stands up with the embassy of the United States and says, I'm not going anywhere. There's massive demonstrations in the streets. There's extreme repression of the people. There's about 50 people murdered so far as a result of those demonstrations. And Evo Morales says, okay, I'm willing to go to new elections. And after he says, I'm willing to go to new elections, the right says that they won't even talk about it, that now the demand for re-elections is no longer, is no longer on the table, and they're going for broke by taking over the government and just, and arresting. There's mass arrests of people from the MAS party, and you have a complete change in the situation there, because there was a willingness on one side to negotiate, to find a pacific solution, and on the other side there was massive repression. So that's why I think the big differences are in those cases, and why you see a more, in the case of Bolivia, you see this concerted effort, not at democracy, but at regime change.
Thanks, both of you. I thought those were both very useful comments to help us understand those dynamics. And as Laura mentioned, we've already started moving into the Q&A from folks, because we've got stuff in the chat. And so I want to keep lifting up some of those questions that we have started to receive from folks. I think we addressed Harrison Harvey's question about the differences and similarities. We have another question about whether or not the progressive governments in Latin America have taken on neoliberal policies because they are being pressured from international aid or from international financial institutions. So I don't know if either of you would like to take up that question. And then we have another question about the environment, but I think there are enough different that we'll take up one at a time. Rick, did you want to weigh in on that?
I couldn't quite hear you on that. I'm getting back online now. The internet is back up.
The question was, you need to cut one of your, here, I'll mute you.
Yeah.
Never mind, I muted you. You're good. The question was whether or not some of the so-called progressive governments in Latin America are taking on a more neoliberal line because they are being pressured through international aid or international monetary, the IMF or the IFIs in general. And I guess I might extend that a bit to kind of try to open up a little conversation about how that pressure is also influencing on the issue of migration policy. Rick, are you still there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back. Maybe I didn't catch all of that.
Maybe we'll let Laura kick it off then.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question also, if you want to see it, is in the chat section. Unfortunately, almost when we talk about Evo Morales in Bolivia, when we talk about Rafael Correa in Ecuador, they're true believers in the extractivist model. This has not been under pressure. There's just recently, about just a week ago, there was an interview with Rafael Correa, who is here in Mexico, in which they asked him specifically about this extractivist model, and he said, no, we have an obligation to use our natural resources in order to lift our people out of poverty. So this idea still that the exploitation of natural resources, but now as a part, but by the state, transferring it sort of from private control into greater state control, or at least greater benefits to the state, to the public as a whole, is still very prevalent in many of these countries, and that's what's prohibited them from what's alienated them from part of what is their base, especially indigenous communities. And it's also what has prevented them from having a more radical and more consistent, in my opinion, view of alternative economies and alternative societies that can carry us in a sustainable way into the future. And I mean sustainable both in terms of governability, as well as in terms of economic and environmental sustainability.
Thanks. Rick, did you want to weigh in?
I'm still trying to get a sense of the question. I can't see that for some reason.
The question was, if some progressive governments in Latin America have taken on neoliberal policies, are they doing so because of pressure from international aid?
Yeah, so I definitely think there's been enormous pressure by the IMF and the World Bank to condition anything around neoliberal economic policies throughout the region. And it's been very difficult for even governments to the left, other than some social policy, to really dramatically shift economic policy into something that's more sustainable and really addresses the underlying inequalities. There really needs to be majorly tax reform in the region where wealthy and private sector have to pay for government and for programs, and that's not part of the neoliberal package. And so I think this is a fundamental issue and will define any kind of new social pact in the region. Is going to be defined about who's paying taxes and who's not. When countries have tried to do that, they've had enormous pushback internationally from the international financial institutions, from the United States and the major think tanks, and then the wealthy elites. And I think that, combined with these other political and economic actors who are coming from illicit, who have enormous, especially from the drug trade, there are almost unlimited resources with the amount of money that they're wielding to control government and push policies in favor of what their needs are, as opposed to economic and social policies that actually address fundamental issues around violence, inequality, and environmental sustainability.
Thanks. We do have a specific question about the social protest that just erupted in Mexico. I think this is for you, Laura. And the person asks if there is Madeline Plasencia asks if there is a link to the Americans murdered in Mexico and Mexicans murdered in El Paso. Is there any evidence of retaliation in Mexico?
Well, I mean, I think that they have very different causes. We know now that the murder in El Paso of Mexicans was carried out by white supremacists, an act of domestic terrorism, whereas the murders of US citizens in Mexico were probably, that we still don't have the results of an investigation, but or anyone who's been arrested, and were probably the result of the turf wars between drug cartels in the region. There's still a number of hypotheses about why exactly that happened. And we've been looking at it very closely. I think the important thing to take into account is that when the Mexicans were murdered in El Paso, the Mexican government did not threaten to send the Mexican army in to help the United States get its territory under control. And when the US citizens were murdered in Sonora, of course, Donald Trump did do that. So we have a clear sense there of the kind of different perspective there is towards security in the two countries, in the sense that the US government is clearly seeing Mexico as part of its own national security perimeter, something that's been going on for a long time. It started as part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then used the drug war as an excuse to create that kind of intervention in Mexico's own national security. And there has been a renewed push for Mexico to stick to this failed drug war model, which is what causes the kind of violent occurrences like this murder in Sonora in the first place. In other words, it was a drug war that, with the kingpin strategy of taking out capos, fragments drug cartels, has created, instead of a problem of an illicit business, the drug trafficking, it's created territorial wars because the armed forces are sent out. It's created destabilization in the relationship between the different cartels. You know, it's very clear. after more than a decade that it was the policy itself of the drug war that detonated this rise in violence that we're seeing. And unfortunately, even though the new government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador said that he was going to turn away from that model, with this recent murder, we began to see members of the hawks, Republican hawks in Congress in the United States calling for intervention, calling for greater militarization of Mexico in this context and a renewal of these same failed policies. In Mexico, they're trying to investigate, obviously. They're taking it seriously. And there's big questions of whether the fact that some cartel decided to go against an economically prominent family that has dual citizenship is a way to destabilize the López Obrador government or to send a message to the national government. So it's a very, very sensitive situation that's being followed very closely.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to this environmental question because I think, Laura, you started talking about it with the sort of the neo-extractivist model that's really quite baked into South American economies. And I wondered, Rick, if you had any thoughts about how the environmental conflicts, land conflicts, play into popular unrest in Central America.
Certainly, I think in the case of Honduras, this is a fundamental issue where between local elites wanting to control in the Bajo Aguan area, both for palm oil, which is another monocropping, it's not gold or mineral extraction, but it's another kind of extractive industry. And they definitely want to control the land and have been fighting for who controls that for over 20 years now. And they continuously have flare-ups. The extractive industry around and mining different extractives throughout Honduras also have been forcing people off the land, killing. I think another example is the assassination of Berta Cáceres is another example of the collusion of the state and private actors going after environmental activists who were protesting, the building of a dam that was going to damage their access to the land and what they could do as part of this whole, the government colluding and allowing illicit actors to go in, both controlling extractive industries or access to the land. And I also think, especially in the case, and I think similarly in Honduras and Guatemala between extractives, there are a lot of land conflicts in Guatemala as well. And then you have overlapping that, you have the drug trade routes that the traffickers are using. And so that also has a huge impact on land use in the local population.
Thanks. Just turning to sort of thinking about what might come out of this, because I think that, we're in a moment of quite a lot of tumult, quite a lot of change. Are either of you seeing any emerging political parties or political movements or leaders that are threading the needle in interesting ways that might be coming at these problems from a different angle?
Well, I think what's happening in Chile has been really encouraging because we're seeing a level of grassroots organization, again, particularly among the young. It's nonviolent and it's extremely creative. All the pictures we've been seeing of a giant sit-in with guitars, singing songs by Victor Jara, or an orchestra playing in the central square, or projecting the faces of the dead on 12-story buildings. We're seeing this tremendous creativity there, and we're seeing the imagination of a new generation coming to the fore. Right now, what they're asking for is saying, even more than just a change in the leadership, is a constitutional assembly. They have a constitution that was written by a dictator. essentially. And there's a debate now because the government that has had to cave after calling them aliens, as we noted at one point, at the beginning of the conflict, has had to recognize that there's a real grassroots sentiment out there. And the latest poll showed that 85% of the population support the protests. So he's in a corner. And so he agreed to a constitutional Congress in which members of Congress would draft a new constitution, but the people are saying that's not okay. We need to do it ourselves. We want everyone involved. So they're also breaking out of this just representative democracy, and beginning to create and demand more grassroots style democracy as well. In Honduras, this is what's happening. For so long, it continues to be, the demand was fuera jo, that Juan Orlando stepped down after the fraudulent elections and the accumulation of being basically charged or cited as a drug trafficker in the case of his brother. It's just a huge accumulation of factors that make them consider him an illegitimate president. But now as well, what they're doing is they've created the platform for the defense of health and education. And so they've got 20 some tables set up to create alternative proposals in all of these areas. The teachers have come together with the nurses, with the doctors, with campesinos. We're seeing intersectorial organization. So there's a construction process going on there as well as the protest. I think our job is to be aware of that and to look for ways to support it. At the same time, as I mentioned before, as we look at what our government is doing to hold those grassroots democratic movements back.
Yeah, I would add, I think those are great examples. I do think I'm very concerned about what's happening in Bolivia, given Senator Áñez, who basically swore herself in as president and recently tweeted, I think it was yesterday or today, that she praised for the day that Bolivia is free of satanic indigenous rituals and that all of los indios need to leave the city. So what we're seeing there is the expression of right-wing extremism and racism, which is very disconcerting, given that Bolivia also has a lot of popular movement organizations that are well organized and also demanding greater democracy. So that, I think, is disconcerting in some ways because it could lead to ongoing violence in that country if there isn't a peaceful solution. But the fact that this was taken over basically through the military, I think that forced Evo Morales out of power, and that this woman is now taking over. I think we're going to have to watch and see what happens next. I'm very concerned in Guatemala and Honduras that people are expressing in the civil society, despite it's been over a decade that they've been out mobilizing, organizing, and protesting, and people tell us that they're feeling tired out. And so the support, the kinds of support that Laura mentioned is really critical. People going to visit, we just sent a group of people who were out in Toccoa visiting people fighting for environmental rights. And they said, as long as people come and we know that somebody is supporting us, we're going to continue to fight. So it is really important, the international solidarity that these communities and different organizations receive in order to continue that. In Guatemala, people are very concerned. There's been a really strong civil society in Guatemala that supported the International Commission Against Corruption, but also that's been dismantled at this point. And so there's concern about people having enough energy and the resources to continue struggling, and what appears to be somebody who's going to come in with a very authoritarian, very hardline and repressive approach to human rights in that country. So I would say there's also continued cause for concern about what's happening and what could happen to a lot of the social movements as they're being threatened from some of these elites.
Thank you. And I guess actually, as long as we're kind of going down that path, I'm going to actually move to the last question that I had for you. And if there's anyone else that has questions, you can throw them up into the chat and we'll see if we can get to one or two of them. But I think what you started to allude to, this sort of loss of hope or this wearing out, also is a factor in terms of displacement, both internal displacement and emigration. And I'm just wondering, if you think, if you could talk to us a little bit about that phenomenon, what do you think really are the factors that really would need to be addressed so that people can start to feel like there is a future for them? And I think you started talking about this a little bit, Rick, what it is that they will need in order to be able to do that, and what those of us who perhaps are working on these issues from the United States could be doing to be more helpful.
So I think around the migration issues, there is, the combination of factors that are driving people that are very difficult to separate out. But violence certainly is a principal driver, and there's a causal relationship between homicides and people leaving Central America. Michael Clemens has done some really good work in establishing that for every 10 homicides in El Salvador, for example, 6 people leave. So there is a very causal relationship. Around the environment, Honduras, and this has been very little talked about, Honduras has had drought 5 out of the last 6 years. And we know that in the first year of a drought, people simply eat less. In the second year, they start to sell their household items. In the third year, they sell the land if they own it and they leave. Or they leave and look for work either in the city or somewhere else. And so I think that family reunification and simply the lack of opportunity, and then on top of that, you throw illegitimate government, where there's been a coup, where there have been fraudulent elections in Honduras, and then recently in Guatemala, they just took $345 million away from education and social programs and put them into the military. This has caused just people to feel desperate and say, well, if this is so illegitimate, nobody is going to solve this problem. I have no other choice but to leave. So I think we need to understand that, as the discourse in the US seems to be, people are gaming the system somehow. And as I like to put it, when somebody is pointing a gun at you, you're not thinking about the wall or the US policy 3,000 miles away. You're thinking, how do I survive in this context? So I think what we need to be aware of is, and these third country policies for asylum cases can really create a disaster in these countries. Guatemala, there are an estimated 51,000 people at the border seeking entry into the United States from Central America and other regions. That's a huge number. And last year, Guatemala processed about 262 applications for asylum. So if you start flooding that with other asylum cases, they have no capacity whatsoever to address that. And so I think we need to be very wary of what these agreements are and be advocating and pushing the Congress to really take a serious look at what's happening there, and that cutting off the aid is just undermining any of the gains that have been made in the last few years in the Northern Triangle especially. I mean, homicides had dropped between 2015 and 2018 by 50% in El Salvador and 35% in Honduras, largely due to very targeted foreign aid and some programs that were becoming more effective. That now has all been suspended. And so that's the kind of aid I think that can be very effective when it's well targeted, and what we need to advocate that they reinstate that foreign aid, as opposed to financing border police and creating asylum capacity that could take years to actually build that kind of capacity.
Thanks,
Okay,
Laura.
well, really quickly, because we're coming to the end here, I have a different perspective on the issue of aid in particular. I was in Honduras last month, and I talked to people, maybe 2 months ago. The Pelosi delegation had just been there. The Mexican government had just pledged, López Obrador had just received Juan Orlando Hernández to pledge $30 million as part of his program to reduce immigration through development aid. And the United States, of course, and then it was right about this time when Honduras signed the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is absolutely and utterly absurd. That would mean that they would take any migrants who are going up toward the United States. When they signed that is when Trump announced that he was reinstating aid as well. And while I agree that, you know, economic aid is somewhat better than security aid, I do not agree that it has been useful. Even the police and judicial reform programs, not in Mexico under the Merida Initiative, not in Central America under the Central American initiatives either. There's no real evidence for that except for USAID studies, which obviously you're going to say we're doing a great job. And also that when I asked people specifically in Honduras, especially people in the opposition, they said, please do not give us aid. What you are doing is you're fortifying the illegitimate presidency of Juan Orlando Hernandez. With this new government in Guatemala, it's going to be pretty much the same situation. And the only way that they think that they can create a new level of stability, you know, is by cutting off that aid. So I think that we really need to take that into account. There's been a knee-jerk progressive reaction that, oh no, cut off aid to Central America. That has really surprised me, because most of us come from movements where we are very well aware that even economic aid to mega projects, to security, obviously, is detrimental, the way that it's applied from US governments, and especially US governments like Donald Trump's. So the idea that we should be defending US aid when we've developed a critique of the role of US aid in the continent that goes back decades and decades and decades is somewhat difficult for me to understand, but particularly in this sense where there is no legitimate counterpart in Honduras to receive that aid, and where there's no evidence that interventionary aid from the United States can really help the situation until Hondurans themselves are able to resolve the political crisis.
So we've gone over just a sec, but I will give you a minute to respond to that, Rick.
Yeah, I'm sorry if it sounded like, I do think taking some of this away basically leaves people without many options. And I agree that any aid from the United States would need to be very much redone and rethought for it to be effective in this. And that most of it doesn't go to the government, US foreign aid. So while it can prop up, I tend to disagree with that. It generally goes into directing food security and other programs that can be effective if they're rethought. It will not address the political legitimacy, and I think that's what we all need to be talking about in terms of the aid will not address democracy issues. That really has to be supported with the grassroots movements.
Thanks. And thank you to both of you. I think you've really helped us think much more carefully about these expressions of popular unrest that we're seeing throughout the region. There's obviously much more to talk about, and we are going to do continuing with this kind of webinar. We're hoping that Eduardo Gudinas will may be able to join us sometime in the near future as well, and we'll do a deeper dive perhaps into the ecological and the dependency of the ecological and economic issues. Laura says, support the Berta Cáceres Act.
It's not that I have to have the last word, but this act is critical for Honduras.
Which, just say 2 seconds about what it is.
The Berta Cáceres Act would cut off all security aid to Honduras under the Juan Orlando government because of the questions of its legitimacy. And it's been in Congress for a long time, has quite a bit of support, but needs a little more to get over the.
Yeah, so we're at a kind of yucky moment in Congress at the moment where not that much goes anywhere. So that's But that is absolutely something. It's a tool that's out there. It's a tool that, along with the Magnitsky Act, I think, which has sometimes been helpful to stop the flows in certain moments. But yes, it would be a tool to try to cut off that support to an illegitimate government. So that's obviously something that many of our organizations have worked on over the years. But again, I guess I just really would like to thank you, because I think this is important to go also beyond a bit our comfort level, where we tend to talk a lot about Mexico and Central America, and really trying to see what's going on in Latin America from a broader context, including the Caribbean, Haiti, the sort of very invisible issues going on in the Caribbean, and particularly in Haiti, as well as the very visible issues going on in South America, but that are often reported in the US media in very simplistic black and white, good guys, bad guys, and the good guys are often not really the good guys. So I think having this much more nuanced conversation has been super useful. I don't know if either of you have any last parting thoughts for us before we wrap up. And I just, from our side, from Alianza Americas and from Latin American Working Group, we really wanted to just thank you so much for spending this time with us.
No, just thanks. It's great to open up these spaces for discussion, because we need to do collective analysis. Nobody can figure it out unless we put our brains together.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. This has been a very interesting discussion. And I just seeing in the chat box, CAFTA DR comment, and we didn't really get into that, but it's done nothing for the whole region. And the whole economic model is really, I think, coming under question at this stage, and is a topic for another day. And what can be done actually in the region to really foster greater equality and sustainability. I mean, that's one of the fundamental questions, along with political legitimacy.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to both of you. And thank you to all of our listeners and attendees. You sent us some great questions, and I hope we've done a little bit to answer them. And this will be continued moving forward. Thanks so much to everyone. And we'll meet up on another day. Thanks.
Great.